I'm Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Clean up your damn room. Stand up straight with your shoulders back and listen to the Patrick Coffin Show.
And thank you, Dr. Peterson. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. So glad to be with you. The Second Vatican Council ended in December 1965, almost 55 years ago. Veritatis Splendor. We celebrated the 25th anniversary of that encyclical by St. John Paul II. Humanae Vitae turns 50 this year. And a lot of ink has been spilled about the hermeneutic of continuity versus discontinuity with respect to the Second Vatican Council. So what do we do about the discontinuities represented by the papacy of Pope Francis and his seeming change of things that were heretofore thought unchangeable? We're going to talk with New York Times op-ed writer, columnist Ross Douthat about his new book, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism, right here on The Patrick Coffin Show. Straight ahead. Yes, indeed. Ross Douthat is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times and the author of Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, and Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class. He sparred on TV with both Bill Maher and Father James Martin, which is a very strange Kevin Bacon scenario. And his latest book is titled To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. I've flashed the title right here. Ross, thank you so much for carving time to be with us. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Patrick.
I like the way you get into the topic of Pope Francis and the sense of discontinuity, because you begin with three different versions of the effect of the Second Vatican Council and the uneasy truce that exists in the Church about what the meaning of the letter of Vatican II and how the spirit of Vatican II kind of emerged. I like to say that the spirit of Vatican II is any directive that does not bear relationship to the letter of Vatican II. But what are could you give a compressed version of those three accounts of the Second Vatican Council?
Sure. So, I think this is something that most Catholics and observers of the Church are generally aware of, but there are basically two big stories that more liberal and more conservative Catholics have told about the Council and its aftermath for the last 30 or 40 years. And the first story, the more liberal story, is that the Council was supposed to be not just a reform unto itself, but sort of the opening of this broader era of reform. So the specific things that the Council did and the moves in its aftermath, changing Mass into the vernacular and so forth, were just supposed to be the beginning. And the important thing about the Second Vatican Council was sort of its directionality, that by making this kind of partial truce with liberal modernity, democracy, sort of, trying to improve the Church's relations with the Jews, opening a new era of ecumenism. This was supposed to, in turn, set the stage for further liberalization, especially around both theological issues, but also all of these hot-button issues of sexual ethics, the celibate priesthood, and so on. And this new springtime, this era of reform, was then ruthlessly choked off by John Paul II and Benedict. And everything that's gone wrong in the Church since then, up to and including the sex abuse crisis, can be laid at the door of this conservatism that couldn't see what the Holy Spirit was doing and what it wanted the Church to do next. That's the liberal story. Then the conservative story is basically that what the Second Vatican Council explicitly did, again, ecumenism, accepting liberal democracy, the change in church rhetoric around the Church's relationship to Judaism, that was all good. But none of that amounted to a change of doctrine or a change of moral teaching. And in fact, the Church can't change doctrine and can't change moral teaching. And therefore, everything related to Vatican II needs to be interpreted, as you said, through this hermeneutic of continuity. And therefore, John Paul II and Benedict, far from being the wicked conservatives choking off renewal, were delivering the authoritative interpretation of Vatican II. And in fact, all of the more liberal forces inside the Church, but also visible in Protestant denominations around the same time, that wanted the Church to just sort of adapt itself to the sexual revolution. All of those groups and movements ended in sterility, declining numbers, general Church decline. And so by the time the 21st century rolled around, it was clear that not only was the John Paul and Benedict interpretation authoritative, but in fact, this sort of hermeneutic of continuity, this conservative Catholicism that accepted Vatican II, was the only plausible path forward for Catholic Christianity in the new millennium. So I'm trying to keep it short.
It is. No, that's a very good.
Those are the two sort of warring narratives, I think, that you see in almost every argument about the church. And what I try and do in the book is then not synthesize the two exactly, but basically say, offer a sort of third narrative, which basically says that both groups were sort of right about Vatican II, in the sense that the letter of Vatican II didn't change any doctrine, but that there was this sort of deliberate ambiguity in the writing of Vatican II, the documents of Vatican II, that reflected the fact that there were a lot of people at the Second Vatican Council who wanted further change, who believed in what came to be called the spirit of Vatican II. Yeah. And that sort of complexity explains this ongoing tension and civil war within the church, that both sides have a kind of point about what was in or implicit in those documents. And then that the conservatives are generally right, that liberal Catholicism, like liberal Christianity in general, has failed to be dynamic and growing, failed to reproduce itself in the Catholic context, failed to produce large numbers of vocations. But at the same time, the conservative synthesis of John Paul II and Benedict was weaker in various ways than conservatives wanted to admit, that the sort of conservative side of the church had less power within the church and less cultural influence generally than conservatives wanted to believe, that the argument, that certain things could change, and it wasn't a change of teaching, like on the death penalty. There was always a certain ambiguity and uncertainty there, and that all of those weaknesses have then been exposed in the age of Pope Francis, the subject of the book, where Francis has in various ways sort of brought liberal Catholicism out of exile, reopened arguments that conservatives thought were closed, and again exposed how even 50 years after the council, even after two conservative popes, the church remains sort of permanently divided on these questions of how much it can and cannot change.
Could you say, no matter where one is on the theological spectrum, everyone has to admit that St. John Paul II and, at the time, Father Joseph Ratzinger were both at the council. They participated intimately in the writing, drafting, editing, and arguing about what went into it. So they're eminently qualified to kind of pronounce upon the meanings of the texts and how they're to be implemented as eyewitnesses.
No, and much of the disputes within Catholicism after the 60s, at least until recently, were disputes between people who were all at Vatican II. And the conservative position was basically a position that the liberals were right, or the liberalizers, or the reformers, whatever you want to call them, were right about some or many or all of the changes made then. But at a certain point, they stopped being right. And they started advocating changes that the church couldn't make. The thing about the Francis era, again, is that it has sort of breathed new life into a different critique, which is the more traditionalist critique, which was Benedict partook of a little bit, especially around the liturgy, John Paul II less so. But this was the critique that said that actually, even if the documents of Vatican II themselves were okay, the translation of the Mass into the vernacular was kind of a disaster, and even some of the documents in Vatican II were immediately misinterpreted or weren't as binding as previous councils and so on. And that traditionalist strand was sort of a buried and marginal thing. It was even in partial schism in the case of the Society of St. Pius X. And I think that with a more liberal and liberalizing Pope, traditionalists in many cases are feeling vindicated and saying, we were right and John Paul II was mistaken all along. So it sort of widened the range of debate even among conservative Catholics, I think, these last 5 years of Francis.
We'll linger just a bit longer on the Second Vatican Council. I was rereading parts of Gaudium et Spes when I was doing an expanded version of my book on Humanae Vitae, which is now called the Contraception, Deception. You see how I just did that shameless ad just briefly. If you read number 48 to say of 52 of the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, there's a kind of a almost naivete about the world and the fact that it's called the pastoral constitution of the church and the modern world, as though the modern world is not the same thing as the fallen world ruled by, Satan and darkness and the fallenness of the world. There's a great ambiguity there, even in the title of the document, and a tentativeness about the norms that were later spelled out in Humanae Vitae. It's almost like the Council Fathers were saying, look, the Pope is examining the findings of the Commission on Natality set up by his predecessor. In the meantime, the norms are in place, which is not exactly a ringing endorsement to 2,000 years of apostolic teaching on contraception. So here's my question about that. Do you see, let's say, Section 8 of Amoris Laetitia as the kind of apotheosis of a trend that began at the Second Vatican Council with a kind of inbuilt DNA ambiguity that it's like a Rorschach test. They're going to conclude from it what they want based on their own lens?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, you have to read Amoris Laetitia as being in a kind of argument with Veritatis Splendor about how to read Vatican II. And Veritatis Splendor is basically saying, ignore any ambiguities. The church is still teaching, a sort of essentially objective vision of sexual ethics and moral ethics writ large. Mm-hmm. And Amoris Laetitia is saying, well, but, you have to take concrete circumstances into account, and people can know the moral law and have trouble following it, and so on. And, there are passages, I don't have the documents in front of me, but there are passages in those two encyclicals that, at the very least, they're in sort of friendly dialogue with one another, but really, I think they're in a certain degree, I apologize for that pinging, a certain degree of contradiction with one another. And I agree, it goes back to, again, if not the letter, the mood of Vatican II was a mood of optimism, sort of strange optimism in certain ways, given that they were, 15 or 20 years removed from the charnel house of World War II, but a very characteristic 60s optimism about, the sort of world made new and the possibilities for Christian mission in it. And remember, it was all happening before the real sexual revolution and the secularization associated with it began in earnest. So even in conversations about, the pill had just been invented, even in conversations about birth control, there was no sense of sort of where the sexual culture was going to go in just 5 or 10 years thereafter. And there is, people talk about someone like Teilhard de Chardin, the French Jesuit paleontologist, who had this sort of, semi-heretical, in traditional terms, vision of sort of divine progress in history as sort of his spirit is in the documents, the spirit of sort of Chardinism, which was very much a 60s spirit, this idea that sort of, slightly Hegelian, providence is acting in history, the modern world is some kind of potential fulfillment of something. And, and that has returned in certain ways under Francis, although the fascinating thing about Francis is that in other cases, he's incredibly pessimistic about the modern world, right? His encyclical on ecology, is this deeply pessimistic critique, not just of sort of polluting companies and so on, but of secular technocracy writ large. So that, in that sense, it's a more pessimistic, in certain ways, anti-modern pontificate. Yeah. But on everything related to the sexual revolution, there's this sense that, there's a modern maturity of believers and a maturity of conscience that the church has to respect and accept and so on, which, to my mind, doesn't map onto the realities of life in the sort of sterile, Me Too, men and women at each other's throats West. But that I think is certainly the mood of that document on stuff related to sex and marriage.
I agree. It's counterintuitive that he keeps recommending the Benson novel, Lord of this World, this dystopian technocratic critique, very kind of sort of dour English novel. And has any pope in recent memory mentioned the devil more frequently than Pope Francis?
No, I mean, there is a side of Francis that is, again, very traditional in certain ways, he's pungently moralistic on, issues that, whether it's sort of, you can pick up threads that the church has dropped in certain ways, like usury, for instance. When Francis talks about sort of the modern financial system, there are echoes of this long-standing Catholic tradition of attacking money lending and usury that the modern church has, at most, you can say, it's sort of let slip. And so in that sense, there are all kinds of ways in which what people sometimes call his left-wing politics are connected to the Catholic past. It's just that he clearly believes, and has surrounded himself with people who also believe, that on the particular questions related to the sexual revolution, the questions where, John Paul II and Benedict, especially John Paul, wanted to sort of confront and challenge where the West has been and is going, that instead the church needs a truce, and that this kind of truce will enable evangelization and missionary work again. That once you have people no longer thinking of the church as scolding them about their second marriages, then people will return to the sacraments, return to the pews, and so forth.
As long as we don't talk about what the man from Nazareth had to say about that, Jesus,
well, right.
Jesus
no, I think.
I'm not disagreeing, but people, we sort of politicize, sociology-ified our faith, and we forget about the words of Christ, which are plain and quite unadorned about things like divorce and remarriage.
Right. No, and this is, I think it's important to sort of, on the one hand, present what the Holy Father is doing in an honest and respectful light, but at the same time, no, the irony of the Francis era is that he spends so much time attacking conservative Catholics for being Pharisees, basically, for being like the doctors of the law who challenged Jesus and so on. But on this, especially this particular point about divorce and remarriage, it was the Pharisees who took the position that divorce was okay and needed to be tolerated.
That is the
Jesus
irony.
Who had the absolutizing words that shocked everybody. And it's an irony that I have not seen the Pope and his sort of allies and advisors really confront in their rhetoric.
You cite a 1972 book by Dean Kelly that, with pretty strong social science data, indicate that conservative churches tend to boom when you raise the standard, when you call men especially to give their lives to Christ and live out the gospel in a way that's in continuity with the great tradition. People are attracted to it, and the memberships tend to swell. And liberalizing churches seem to be on the fast track to the dodo bird fate. Do you think that also applies to Catholic environments where? Let's look at Orthodox bishops and the way they lead. They tend to attract young men who want to be priests, and they have a fulsome membership. It seems to me. Just to touch on that.
Yeah. So this is an argument that sociologists have been making for a long time, and that conservative Christians have obviously picked up on, which is that, as you say, that sort of liberalization and sort of relaxing the requirements, lowering the standard for being part of a church, for being priests, and so on, doesn't, as some people would expect, lead to large numbers of people rushing in. Instead, it tends to lead to sort of stagnation and decline. And more conservative churches since the 70s have tended to see more stability and growth in their membership than, the United Church of Christ, the Episcopal Church, all of these mainline Protestant bodies, which have gone into steep decline. And that is true, again, generally within Catholicism, that if you're looking for orders with booming vocations, if you're looking for dioceses that attract large numbers of men to the priesthood, you're more likely to find them in more conservative and sort of self-consciously Orthodox dioceses. I do want to qualify that, though, by saying that in Protestantism and Catholicism both, there has been a kind of ceiling on conservative growth. There has been a limit to, for a while, like when I was a teenager and an early 20-something, when George W. Bush was president and religious conservatives felt like they were sort of ascendant in American culture, there was this sense that this alliance of conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals was basically going to fill the void left by mainline Protestantism and become sort of the religious center in America. And that didn't really happen. And it didn't happen because there have been, for now, limits on how many people in the modern context are attracted to these churches. And it may be that just reflects a failure among, even among conservative Catholics to be dynamically orthodox enough. And it's certainly the case that Catholicism is it's the one church that is really sort of permanently divided between liberal and conservative, modernist and traditionalist approaches. The sex abuse crisis and everything else has played a role in weakening Catholicism. Yeah. But again, relative to where we were 15 years ago, relative to where we were when John Paul II was Pope, there does seem to be a limit on the growth that conservatism that we have right now alone supplies. And like with something like Humana Vitae, there's a limit. It's still only 10 to 15% of Catholics who accept and try and practice the teaching. It seems to be there is this fundamental tension between post-sexual revolution life and traditional Christianity that not even conservative churches have, I think, found a way to overcome.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why I returned to the faith of my childhood. All my friends, if anything, they were taking the exit route out of the church because of the birth control thing. I found it to be resonant and coherent with the rest of Catholic teaching about the human person. So it was a light to me. It was a real beacon. It's not terribly well argued. In fact, it's more witness than argumentation. But I wanted to ask you about the resignation of Benedict, and get your take on the traditionalist critique of Pope Benedict's abdication is that it was a good father who left the family and was replaced by an abusive stepfather.
That's a strong way of putting it.
Well, that's right.
The issue with Benedict's abdication is, and the issue with papal abdications in general, is that the papal role is paternal. It is not, the Pope is not supposed to be the CEO of Catholicism Incorporated. His fundamental role is to preserve doctrine, not to sort of be instituting new programs constantly and so on. And, there's a sense in which the entire atmosphere of the papacy, the fact that, the room where you go after you're elected Pope is called the Room of Tears and so on, that there's a sense in which there's supposed to be a kind of witness of not martyrdom exactly, but something like that.
Yeah, the reality of the cross.
Right, the Pope is bound to the office. And, we witnessed this with John Paul II. Now, with his descent through Parkinson's disease to death. Now, obviously, we also witnessed that, during John Paul's descent, the church was sort of badly governed. The sex abuse crisis broke out in the U.S. He didn't handle it well. Sort of opportunists and corrupt figures gained probably more influence. And, all of that was in Benedict's mind. It's very easy to see why Benedict ended up deciding as he did. And you do have to balance, the reality is that the church has to be governed. There has to be someone in charge in the everyday. The people around Benedict were obviously not particularly trustworthy, not doing a particularly good job.
Yeah.
He knew that. He felt himself ill-equipped to deal with that. He thought, and he is certainly a holier and more prayerful person than most of the people criticizing him. So he thought that what he was doing was in tune with God's will. And one hesitates to question that. But from the point of view of, I think the condition of the church, the aftermath has not worked out particularly well. It has not brought unity to the church. Francis has not pursued the kind of practical reforms in Rome that Benedict failed to pursue. And just as the Pope who succeeded, I tell the story in the book, the last Pope who resigned was Celestine in the Middle Ages, and he was succeeded by a Boniface who was, this incredibly active and dynamic figure, but also in certain ways a kind of politically disastrous figure who left the church in a huge mess. And if you wanted to be a little providentialist about this, you could say that there is a lesson there and perhaps a lesson in the Francis era. And that lesson is don't resign.
Don't resign. Careful what you wish for.
Yep.
Yeah. It seems that there are reasons piling up now that would suggest John Paul II should have resigned 5 years before he died, and that Benedict would not have inherited the spectacular mess that he did with Maciel and Boston and all that terrible fallout. I agree with you. I think John Paul II, in his ailing, weak years, while you have to admit, dying in public was quite a witness to Christ's faithfulness, and he lived out the teachings that he spoke of and about suffering. But if John Paul II had resigned, which is a papal prerogative in light of Celestine, then it would have been a very different papacy of maybe perhaps Benedict wouldn't even have been elected, but we'll never know that.
I think he wouldn't have been. I think, the thing is, Benedict was elected. This is one of the frustrations. Benedict was elected for the same reason that Francis was. The theory was that, the cardinals understood that things were a mess in Rome and that the sex abuse crisis needed to be cleaned up. And Benedict at the time, he had the reputation of the enforcer, right? The doctrinal enforcer.
The Panzer Cardinal.
He was right. He was not corrupt, not personally corrupt. He had tried to get Maciel disciplined when John Paul resisted it. He sort of knew where the bodies were buried, as it were, and people thought, well, we'll put this guy in charge and he'll clean things up.
Yeah.
And instead, Benedict, God bless him, went and wrote a lot of books and let some incompetent people, he made some good moves. He disciplined people who needed disciplining and so on, but he did it gently, right? And he left, as we see in the case of whatever he apparently did with Theodore Cardinal McCarrick, he sort of assumed that, age and death would take care of some of these corrupt figures, and you could sort of discipline them softly and silence them gently, and time would take care of the problem. And then he resigned. And so then the cardinals met again and decided, well, this time we tried the insider. The insider didn't clean things up sufficiently. So now we'll try the austere, moderate outsider. Yeah. And Francis, Benedict wanted to be a theologian instead of really governing. And Francis wants to be a liberalizer in some sense of doctrine and teaching. And rather than, so he's prioritized that over cleaning up the Vatican and has ended up bringing back in, again, figures like McCarrick and Godfrey Daniels of Belgium, who were his ideological allies, who were themselves corrupt.
Yeah. And Martini, who openly dissented from Humana Vitae. Ross, do you remember where you were when the Francis election came out and he walked onto the loggia and said, Buenos Aires? Do you remember where you were?
I was in my then home in Washington, D.C., sitting there with my wife, who is not, well-versed in the minutiae of papal elections, frantically Googling and trying to figure out exactly who Jorge Bergoglio was.
Yeah. There seems to be two Jorge Bergoglios. There was the you mentioned the word austere. I'll say unsmiling, kind of remote Archbishop of Buenos Aires, had a distaste for interviews, didn't like journalists. And then after March 2012, 2013? I'm not very good at math. Anyway, when Pope Francis was elected, now we have Pope Francis, not Pope Francis the First. This is another break from tradition, calling himself after St. Francis of Assisi, and he paid his own bill at the hotel, and he carried his own luggage, and he got rid of the red Prada shoes, and he wore black shoes, and he called the kiosk to cancel his newspaper subscription. He made all these calls and seemed to have come alive in front of a microphone. And the famous interview back from Rio, where we got who am I to judge him? The papacy seems to have changed him.
Yes, there's no question. I mean, some of these qualities were there already. It's just, he rode the subway in Buenos Aires. The sort of, the self-conscious austerity was already there. The willingness to sort of publicize it and play to the media was new. The Francis of Buenos Aires would have paid his bill but done it privately. He would have called people, and some of that is just a change in how much attention you get, right? Like Francis can't call someone privately anymore because that person will tell the press what happened. That's right. A reality. But no, there was clearly a shift in his approach, and a shift that, I, as someone who works in the secular press and writes about Catholicism from within a secular newspaper, I was shocked and amazed at his ability to sort of lean into the sort of the public relations side of the papacy and change its image very, very quickly. I mean, you remember under Benedict, between his reputation and the scandal, the shadow of sex abuse and the sort of misbegotten running of the Vatican, all church coverage in the secular press in the West was negative for a long period of time. And then Francis came in, and simply by making these gestures, this was long before he, started pushing changes around divorce and remarriage or the death penalty, just by making these gestures, the press sort of rallied to him and loved him and photographed him and put him on magazine covers and all the rest, which was a remarkable thing.
There's almost an inverse opposite picture of, let's say, John Paul II and Pope Benedict, who were not well beloved by the editorial staff where you are at the New York Times, who was not the darling of CNN. Both those popes were seen as autocratic, ultra-conservative, all the buzzwords that liberals cast upon more traditional-minded people. And yet, they drew massive crowds. I had the unmerited grace of meeting Pope Benedict. I introduced him to my father in Rome, had a conversation that lasted a lot longer than I thought it would, and you could not get a seat at the general audience. You look at photos of Phoenix Park in 1979 with John Paul II, half of Ireland or a third of Ireland showed up. On the other hand, with Pope Francis, he seems to be the mascot of the liberal mainstream media, but the crowds are much smaller. It's almost like different groups of people love this pope for various reasons, few of which have to do with wanting to become Catholic as a result. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I think you have to. John Paul II he had a complex relationship with the media in that, like Francis, he had this tremendous personal charisma. He was a globetrotter. He was, the foe of Soviet communism, and so there was a part of him that did get a lot of favorable coverage from the press, even as the fact that he was seen as a conservative sort of created conflict and critique and so on. So he was sort of a middle way between where Francis is as sort of the darling of the secular press and where Benedict was as the bête noire. Yeah. And some of the change in the crowds is just a change in the West, right? You go to Ireland, when John Paul II went to Ireland, Ireland was Catholic. When Francis went to an Ireland that is effectively post-Catholic. And in the U.S., where the church is, for all its problems, still more robust, you did have big crowds for Francis. So you could, there is some of that is that change. But no, there's no question. I mean, the Francis effect as we see it now, right? There was a lot of talk about the Francis effect. The Francis effect as we see it now is an effect of people saying, man, he almost makes me want to be Catholic again.
Yeah.
But that almost sort of contains right now the limits of that effect. And meanwhile, more conservative and traditional Catholics are sort of, in many cases, disturbed and confused by the pontificate. So he has, at least at this moment, he has succeeded in sort of upsetting and dividing the core of the faithful without reaping the benefits of evangelization that, if it really worked, his style would reap, I think.
Sure.
But you also have to say, you judge a papacy 20, 25 years on. I mean, you don't want to sort of leap to too many conclusions in the midst of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. I note that.
Although I wrote a book that's filled with conclusions, so physician, heal thyself.
Right. Well, I note in your book you cite one of the National Catholic Reporter commentators who said it feels like a whole new church, words that would never be spoken under Benedict or John Paul II. That's kind of it's a temperature-taking thing for the NCR crowd to say it feels like a whole new church, because it echoes what Theodore McCarrick said in his 2015 speech to Villanova University. Give Bergoglio 5 years to renew the church, to get it back on track. But when did it go off? When did it go off track, and why? He didn't say.
Well, there's a two-track thing though in these arguments, right? If you complain, as conservatives have been wont to complain, that Francis is making big changes and that some Amoris Laetitia or other moves sort of threaten the deposit of faith, then the Pope's defenders will say, oh, you're exaggerating wildly. Francis is, this is just a pastoral change. These are very modest incremental developments of doctrine. Conservatives are making a mountain out of a molehill. Yeah. But then, so that's sort of one side of things. But then the other side is, when they're sort of touting the papacy, they say, as you say, this is a new paradigm, right? That Francis is a radical pope. He's a revolutionary. You've had, Victor Fernandez, the Argentinian archbishop who has been sort of the papal ghostwriter for some of these documents, has given speeches where he says a version of what McCarrick says. He said this is Francis is trying to make this revolution irresistible. So the question is sort of, which is it, right? Is if the Pope's changes are all sort of these very modest developments that are just pastoral shifts and are totally in keeping with what John Paul II was doing, then why all the revolutionary theatrics? Why the claims of, this sweeping transformation? And I mean, obviously, I think the answer is that the Pope, or at least people around him, really do see this as an opportunity to sort of complete what they see as the revolution of Vatican II, and really sort of, bring the church fully into the modern world. And they only downplay it when as a means of sort of bringing conservatives along gently.
What do you think is the I know you don't have magical soul reading apparatus, but when I observe the Holy Father repeatedly going back to a nonagenarian, Eugenio Scalfari, the atheist editor of La Repubblica, that Pope Francis has said is the only journal he reads. I think he's done 5 interviews now and counting. Mm-hmm. And after every interview, there's a blast of confusion, and the Pope seems to embrace heretical positions like hell doesn't exist, or that our souls are annihilated. And I don't hear direct denials from the Holy Father himself. He doesn't seem to follow up with, of course I believe in hell. Right. Mr. Scalfari misunderstood. You get the Vatican press office almost like coming behind the parade with the pooper scooper, trying to domesticate what he possibly said. I don't know the answer to the question, does Pope Francis believe that the death penalty is intrinsically evil? Does he believe that divorced and remarried Catholics can receive Holy Communion? Does he believe that hell is real and people go there? Do you know the answer to those questions, unambiguously?
I think we have very strong evidence that the Pope believes that divorced and remarried Catholics can, in some cases, receive Holy Communion. How sweeping and how that exactly fits with pre-existing teaching and which arguments specifically he believes justified, I don't know. On the death penalty, I don't know. On the case of hell, I'm skeptical that he really believes in the version of annihilationism that he allegedly espoused to Scalfari. But what I think is clear is that the Pope is aware of the limits that his office imposes on him. He's aware that there are certain things he cannot simply say because they would be in contradiction with prior teaching. But he wants both to make a few specific changes, divorce and remarriage chief among them, and to sort of widen the field of debate. And that's how I read the Scalfari interviews. It's not that the Pope is going to Scalfari and sort of telling him what he really thinks exactly in theological detail. It's that he's going to Scalfari and sort of shooting the theological breeze, as you and I might do after too many pints or something, and letting Scalfari run with that on the theory that it's not his official teaching, but putting out there the fact that these conversations are taking place, by definition, widens the space for debate. So whatever he believes in about hell, he thinks Catholics should be able to sort of argue about it a little more widely than traditional teaching allows, and he's happy to have Scalfari sort of creating that environment, that atmosphere.
Almost a foil or a straight man. I disagree with that. I don't think it's a good way to teach the faithful who have to observe these conversations, that the confusions of which don't get ever clarified. But to be fair, just to look back, since you do in your book, you've got a much more sweeping narrative than just focusing on the things that Pope Francis says or does. Didn't this phenomena of non-authoritative papal unspooling begin with John Paul II and crossing the threshold of hope? Because I remember that there were debates when I was at Franciscan University of Steubenville when it came out, I think in '93, the things that Pope said about Buddhism got him in trouble. There was some elements in that book that people were scratching their heads. Again, I think that was the first extended interview that got a lot of world press that was not an act of the magisterium. And then Pope Benedict, with his conversations with Pete Seyvald, would say things regarding condoms and AIDS in Africa, and that became a brouhaha. So this is not something that Pope Francis has invented.
No, not at all. But what's distinctive about it, and what I think, to my mind, I agree with you, I think it deserves criticism, is this deliberate ambiguity about what he really said, right? You could look at Benedict's interviews with Siewald or look at Crossing the Threshold of Hope, and you could say, well, the Pope said this, so we can argue about where it fits into magisterial teaching.
Right.
With Scalfari, it's all sort of haze and smoke and ambiguity, and that's, to my mind, worse and more irresponsible than simply saying something. But no, I mean, look, Benedict wrote 3 books, right? 3. There were 3, right? The 3 Jesus of Nazareth books.
Yes, yeah, and
they're brilliant.
Yeah, they're
brilliant books. But he
tomes.
published them as Joseph Ratzinger, and he said, "Well, this is my opinion as a theologian and not as a pope." And as a reader and admirer of his theological work, I'm glad they exist. But it does create this very strange division and uncertainty. And look, underlying all of this is the fact that there isn't clear agreement about where infallibility ends, where the what are the what's the difference between the ordinary and extraordinary magisterium, and so on. And I think the good thing about the Francis era is that it is forcing conservative Catholics to come to grips with there is uncertainty here. There are debates we have to have. We can't just say Rome has spoken, the case is closed.
Yeah.
But the way he's doing it is a sort of ambiguous dust-kicking way.
Yeah, he's sort of, and I've said this and people misunderstand what I mean. In my view, Pope Francis is Trump of the left.
Well,
he forces people to take their masks off. All the first principles of what people really believe are suddenly rushing out. For instance, I just read that Father Tom Rosica says that Pope Francis is not attached he doesn't have unhealthy attachments to things like sacred scripture and tradition, that he rules as a king in some way, which is not really in line with what Pope Francis has said about his own rather narrow limit of what papal infallibility means. But I interrupted.
No, I was going to say, this is my sort of, I'm not the only one who has it, but, the parallels between Trump and Francis, obviously personally, morally, and so on, they're very different figures and have very different politics. But the parallels between their styles and sort of, especially now that we have, all of these sort of whistleblowers coming forward in the Vatican around sex abuse and so on, it feels to me at times almost providential, this mirroring in Rome, in the 2 Romes, right? The Washington is sort of the new Rome, and Rome is, of course, the old Rome. And, one of the ironies is that traditionalist Catholics in the United States especially tend to be pretty supportive of Trump and very critical of Francis, and vice versa, and I'm more of a Trump critic, so I see myself as very consistent. I think, the Trump style in the White House is not a good thing, and I think the Francis style in the Vatican is dangerous in its own way as well. But Rosica and his circle, this is one of the questions too about the Francis era, right? Is that he doesn't read a lot of newspapers. He's obviously not on the internet. He is an old man. And you can, in certain ways, he's clearly in control of his pontificate. But there is also this narrative around his pontificate associated with Rosica and Father Antonio Spadaro, these other people in his circle, that is much more aggressive than what the Pope himself has said, and much more theologically radical, I think it's fair to say. And whether that is what Francis himself believes, I really don't know.
I've got a lexicon question. I want you to interpret some of the jargon that the Pope Francis repeatedly uses. But before that, I promised my Coffination members that they could have at you with their questions. And I've got a couple here. Laura Pareto asks, I found it to be quite an enlightening book, in reference to yours. I'd be interested in hearing Russ's take on what aspects of both the general secular culture and inside the Catholic culture we Orthodox lay people can work on most effectively. When we see, quote, transformation or change that's not positive, what are the most effective ways to combat it?
Well, this is the challenge, right? In terms of the papacy, the capacities of the laity, in an ordinary Catholic parish to sort of correct the Pope or challenge the Pope are necessarily incredibly limited. And, this is something as a father I struggle with myself. I've I have very young children who I'm raising as Catholics, and I've written this book criticizing the Pope, but I don't go around telling them exactly what I've said to criticize the Pope. So there is a sense in which, ordinary Orthodox Catholics have to accept, to some extent, a sort of localism, a reality that, you have to trust in, not necessarily that the Holy Spirit is behind everything Francis is doing, but that Providence has some control over circumstances. And being a good Catholic in your parish and building up your local community is the best thing you can do. With that being said, when you come to particular crisis points, like the one we're in right now surrounding sex abuse, but also in sort of fraught moments around the Synod and elsewhere, your bishops are a part of this whole story and a part of this whole process. And bishops have roles as teachers of the faith, and how you communicate with your bishops, how you urge your pastors to communicate with your bishops, how you fund and fundraise for your bishops, all of that has an effect. And the lay Catholic role there, while it's, limited because you're just one person, is real. You see this in Washington, D.C. If you're a Catholic in Washington, D.C. right now, you have choices to make about where you give your money, as, given the situation with Cardinal Archbishop Wuerl. And those choices matter.
Yeah, it's so tempting to go down that avenue, but I want to make sure that my members get their questions in. Marie Ann asks, how to answer the charges of right-wing or Pharisee or judgmental, those are all in quotes, by other Catholics, including priests, which are laid at those who are faithful to the magisterium?
Well, first you have to accept that there's a version of that argument which is correct. There is a temptation for Orthodox Catholics, conservative Catholics, whatever you want to call them, to end up like the elder brother in the parable of the prodigal son, right? And, there's no question that the New Testament is sort of shot through with warnings of the perils of judgmentalism, basically the perils of self-righteousness. And in that sense, conservative Catholics can take Francis's critique and apply it to themselves and use it to scrutinize how they relate to their fellow Catholics, to the secular culture, and so on. There is a incredibly strong need for Catholics to be, I apologize for the pings, for them to be
we're Christians, we forgive you.
That's good. I can't figure out how to turn off the thing on my computer screen to be charitable in their orthodoxy, basically. And that is the balance that you want to strike, to basically say, there's a style of critique of Francis that I don't use in this book and I don't think is profitable for conservatives to use, which is just a sort of hellfire and brimstone critique. And, there are moments when that might be necessary and might be effective. But in general, a certain degree of sort of winsome charity is incredibly is the thing that conservative. If you're talking to your own priest, right? You don't need to shake your finger at him and say, Father, your latest sermon, was ignoring Jesus's clear words about this or that. You need to take the tactful approach and say, Father, I understand what you're saying and so on, and I'm trying to be merciful in my own life. I mean, look, there's a distinction. I live in the secular culture, right? I work at a secular newspaper. I have, a vast network of friendships outside the Catholic Church. And, you have to practice charity and forbearance and not be the guy who's always yelling at people about what they're wrong about, while at the same time maintaining a clarity about what you yourself believe. And the danger of the Francis era is not this sort of general spirit of mercy and forbearance. It is the fact that is being combined with specific changes, potentially, in what the church actually teaches.
Also, don't be afraid of people saying bad things about you. I'm sure you could read hate letters that come at you from multiple angles. That actually would be a good podcast for you to read hate letters to Carnival Calliope music.
Well, it's also, well, if you're on the internet, I mean, it's important, though, to also not let those, the atmosphere on the internet can derange you. And I think it's deranged people on both sides of these Catholic debates. And you need to be able to also sort of step away from it at times and not let the conflicts in Rome or the conflicts on Twitter, get in the way of your prayer life or how you practice your faith.
And just having fun with your kids. Sergei Pronkin asks a very important question. He says, Pope Francois is often addressing mass media over numerous topics important for the society. How can we interpret his sudden refusal to give complete and detailed comment on the questions arising with sexual abuse scandals in the church? I think this is a reference to the Viganò letter. Silence.
Yeah, I mean, now I'll risk being uncharitable, having just called for charity. But I think the Pope's silence, it is strongly suggestive of cover-up. And that doesn't mean that every specific thing that Viganò accuses the Pope and people in the Vatican of doing is true or correct. It doesn't mean that, it could be that the Pope is, feels genuinely that he's done nothing wrong, but sees himself as protecting Pope Benedict or protecting other figures in the Vatican. I mean, there are all kinds of different things that he could be protecting, but the approach of the Vatican suggests that, if the documents that Viganò has called for to be opened up were to be opened up, that there would be, something deeply embarrassing there, which we know to some extent there must be, right? And we know that there was some knowledge surrounding Cardinal McCarrick. We know that someone, this I think is the most important thing. If Francis is, if the best possible interpretation of what Francis did is correct, right? If there were sanctions on Cardinal McCarrick that were loosely imposed, loosely enforced, didn't seem that important, if Francis, chose to believe some exculpatory narrative from McCarrick, then maybe Francis doesn't owe the church a resignation, as Viganò says, but he at the very least owes it a house cleaning. He owes some kind of saying of like, we're going to take steps to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And that is what is being lost, at least for now, in the decision by the Vatican to basically just stonewall and let people sort of play this as a right-wing plot, which, look, conservative Catholics, the church is in a civil war, and both sides are weaponizing the abuse scandal. That is true.
Yeah, that is true. And
but the Pope has an obligation to try and rise above that.
And again, to be fair and balanced, there are two silences. There's also the silence of the other man who could say a few words and clarify, and that's Pope Benedict. And he's also not talking. Chris Karstens, my wife and I lead adult faith enrichment programs at our parish, continuing education for grown-up Catholics. Are there any programs or films we might be able to share that would give perspective and hope? You're also, I didn't mention this, you're also the film critic for National Review. I write a column called The Cinephile, so I'm saturated with the magnificent power of cinema, as Pius the 12th said. Any films or programs that come to mind?
I think the best religious films recently, and these may be sort of obvious choices, or they may not be, but there was the movie of Gods and Men, which came out a few years ago about the Algerian monks martyred by Islamist radicals in the 1990s. For the context of the sex abuse crisis, there's a movie with Brendan Gleeson called Calvary. That's about an Irish priest working in the aftermath of the sex abuse crisis. And sort of, it fits with all of these trends in Ireland in particular, sort of what, the strange role of the priest as this figure of sort of fear, fascination, hatred, and respect all at once.
Not for the faint of heart.
No. Well, none of these movies are. And then I'm just going to, is the title of it. It's a Polish movie about a nun that came out. Ida. It's a movie, by a Polish director about a nun in the aftermath of World War II who's sort of looking into her own past. She's a young nun who has some parental connection to the Holocaust. And again, it's sort of a movie about crises of faith and doubt and so on, but it's not a conventional sort of, nun shakes free of shackles and finds herself movie. It's a much more serious and searching portrait. Gotcha. So those are three, there are many more, but those are the Ida, Calvary, and of Gods and Men are good places to start.
Chris, I would just add one more, and that's Patty Considine's sleeper movie In America, starring Samantha Morton and Jaimin Hansu. Yep. It's a magnificent film. Lapsed Catholics and Jews make the best Christian movies. That's my opinion. All right, we've got a few minutes left, Ross. How about this? When Pope Francis refers to the Jansenists, who are the Jansenists? So this is Pope Francis lexicon here.
Right. So in the 17th century, there was a strong conflict, especially in the French Catholic Church, between the Jesuit order and people associated with a theologian named Cornelius Jansen, who were basically the Jesuits in that period were seen as morally lax, were seen as sort of, ministers to the French court in all its decadence, who would say things like, "Oh, it's okay to duel, it's okay to take a mistress if you have X reasons for it." And they were ferociously attacked by the Jansenists, with Blaise Pascal, the famous mathematician and philosopher, being sort of the chief light of the Jansenists at that period. But the Jansenists' rigorism was rooted in a at least semi-Calvinist theology that was very dark, very pessimistic about human nature. In certain ways, they saw themselves as Augustinians, but there were tensions between their thinking of Aquinas. And ultimately, without endorsing some of the things the Jesuits were doing in the confessional, the papacy sort of came down against the Jansenists and deemed some of their propositions heretical. And Jansenism, while it sort of endured as an intellectual influence in the church, ceased to be a powerful movement.
And so, but when Pope Francis employs the term, who is his real target? His vision would be that we're living through a replay, and that conservative Catholics in this era are like the Jansenists, and they are too rigorous. The Jansenists would say things like, you can't have partial contrition. If you confess just because you fear the pains of hell, that's not enough, and you still shouldn't take the Eucharist. So basically, they had a view that people should almost never take the Eucharist. So anal scrupulosity.
To apply to the current day, it's saying, well, this is just a replay of those debates. The conservatives are too scrupulous, too anal, and even if the liberals make mistakes, like the Jesuits of the 17th century, their hearts are in the right place and their theology is closer to where the church is going to go. So that's sort of a case study in a case where there was a kind of rigorism that was condemned by the church.
And who are the Gnostics? The neo-Gnostics Pope Francis goes after. Are they the liberals?
This is complicated, right? So Francis has these two lines. He will attack the Neo-Pelagians and the Neo-Gnostics. And these are both ancient heresies. The Pelagians were people who thought you could get to heaven without grace. Basically, you just had to work as hard as possible on being a moral person. And Pelagius and Augustine had this famous argument. And the Gnostics were generally a school that sort of thought the world was a totally bad place, maybe created by some sort of demigod, and that you had to escape the world completely. God himself had not created it, and so on. And when Francis first started using these terms, I thought that the Gnostics were his word for sort of theological liberals, and that basically people who think the body doesn't matter, who, a lot of sort of ideology about the sexual revolution, transgender stuff, and so on. It's like you're sort of, you can refashion your body doesn't matter, and so on. And there is a lot of Gnosticism in like New Age spirituality, a lot of sort of these trends in post-60s West. And then the Pelagians, because they think too much about, being a moral person, were the conservatives. That was reading one. In his most recent document, it kind of sounds like he thinks conservatives are both the Gnostics and the Pelagians, that, you're either too concerned about morality or you're a Gnostic because you're too concerned about abstract doctrine rather than the real life of people or something. So I'm not sure exactly how
that part's hard to discern.
To read that. I mean, I think that he's right that, ancient heresies are always alive and well in the modern world. About that, we can all agree.
Because doctors of the law, Jansenists,
they're all Cardinal. They're all Raymond Cardinal Burke.
I feel like he's talking to me. It's like I think he thinks I'm all those things. I have never in my whole life as an adult revert heard a single homily on homosexuality, and it's never been mentioned from the pulpit. I remember one tangential reference to contraception by a really saintly priest in an on-fire parish in Ottawa. From time to time you'll hear a good pro-life homily, but when the Pope talks about the overemphasis in the church on those issues, I just scratch my head. I don't know. Maybe Argentinian priests just constantly pound on the people on those issues. That's a foreign idea to me. Anyway,
that tracks with my experience as well. I think in some outside the United States, it's not that they're giving sermons about contraception, but there is a sort of level of sort of residual clericalism. He talks about priests refusing to baptize the children of unwed mothers. That does seem to happen sometimes in Latin America. There's a style of traditionalism that does exist in pockets in the Catholic world, but I agree it's not even remotely the dominant spirit in the modern church.
Last question, Ross. If the allegations that are made by Archbishop Viganò come to light and they are investigated by objective investigators and they are proven to be true, in light of Pope Francis's famous and reasonable zero tolerance policies, if he stays silent even after it all comes to light, do you think it's appropriate that he step down as Pope?
We don't know what could come out, and so I'm willing to revise my opinion, but my current view is that Pope should not resign except under truly extraordinary circumstances, and what would be appropriate in that context would be for him to break his apologize in-house. And for now, I'm sticking with that take. I think one papal resignation per millennium is about enough.
Yeah, well, that's why I put the if in front of it. It sounds like you need to write multi-volumes if this papacy continues.
There will be a new chapter in the paperback about what's happening now, but buy the hardcover and then get the paperback.
Well, there's lots more to talk about. I'd love to have you come back and do part 2. I just feel like we've scratched the surface of the egg, Ross.
Well, thank you, Patrick. This has been a lot of fun.
All right. The book is called To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. Our guest has been Ross Douthat. Thanks a lot, Ross. I appreciate your time.
Yep.
I learned a ton. All right, this is the Patrick Coffin Show. You can go to patrickcoffin.media and look at the show notes. I will link to the book and the other recommended resources mentioned on today's broadcast. In the meantime, be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.